webcam microphone up close.
Webcam microphone up close.
At the age of 19 in 1962, she was a...
But I have the files. I read this stuff at the National Archives, and I read these other things. I said to myself, how can that be possible? Pistols and fondle slab of choice, I don't know when that was. Internet, professional wrestlers, and not Jesse Ventura style. It doesn't matter where the cartoon comes from, as long as it's real. It doesn't. It's hard to get real information because seriously, they don't want you to just read two sources together. Whenever I try to prove out, it's not. If you expect your government to tell you the truth, you're going to sadly disappoint another one of these things.
Dear Lord, what a dirty, dirty old man, huh?
Really? Can't be serious. Is this really how you want things to be? Come on. More hooker, eruptions. Eruptions, whatever.
Like Dave Powers kind of...
Really?
Allegedly broadcast live from FEMA Region 2. Within the borders of the formerly united and currently occupied states of America, we bring you the Ochelli Effect.
It's like, damn sure, no, I'm an original. We have all these situations. I'd love to know why it takes 50 years, for...
That's that.
For a 19-year-old girl to eventually get up to gumption to put these things out.
And that is certainly that. January 8th, 2015, the Ochelli Effect, as the bumper tells you. I'm your host, Chuck Ochelli, on UCY.TV radio. So, for those of you catching this further downstream, you can always listen to the live shows or pick up the archives. And now there's even a link to the YouTube playlist at ucy.tv/TOE. Anyway. One of the really, I don't even know exactly what adjective to use for the events of what occurred in Guyana, in Jonestown, in the late 70s, all the stuff that happened. I don't even know what adjective to use. Well, here we go again with the wonderful little quick interruptions. But looks like I'm back on the air. Anyway, the mass casualty event that occurred in Guyana in the place that they called Jonestown in the late 70s, I believe it was 1979. I'm not going from any sort of notes or anything like that. I actually have an author on tonight who wrote the book Jonestown Survivor: An Insider's Look, and she'll be joining me in just a few moments. The bottom line here is that a lot of people have had a great many different sort of bits of commentary to make about this situation over the years. Thinking from the common vernacular out there, a lot of people talk about, drinking the Kool-Aid, you know what I'm saying? And this is really where this phrase comes from, because after all, in that event, Jim Jones, who was a leader of sorts of a sect, as it were, a cult, as it were, depending on, whose definition you look at, because to me, just about anything that's an organized religion is essentially a cult, but then again, I'm not normal. The thing is that at the end of the day, what happened here, was it the mass suicide of a great many followers who were following, a megalomaniac over the proverbial psychological emotional cliff? Was it the fact that this guy was, was part of something that connected him directly to the Central Intelligence Agency? Was this an MK Ultra project gone terribly wrong? Was it an MK Ultra project gone terribly right? All of these speculations have been part of the equation over the years. And all of these things, from time immemorial, like I said, have been, talked about in the mainstream media as well as in the alternative media. And the thing is that when we discuss Jonestown, it is also important to not just look at the person of Jim Jones, which is often the character that people do focus on, okay, but also to take a look at the rest of the story, as it were. So hopefully that's what we're going to do tonight. I'm sure we're going to wind up talking about the preacher who was the leader, who at one time was a guy who was selling monkeys door to door, from what I used to read. But that's not going to be the main focus tonight. So, how are you tonight, by the way?
Oh, I'm doing fine, thanks.
I sort of just laid it out here really quickly that, there's been a lot of speculation regarding, those events that occurred in 1979, okay? And really, there is not much said about this in the mainstream media anymore. There is the common vernacular that's utilized, like I've said many times, and a lot of people utilize it, and they talk about drinking the Kool-Aid and all this other kind of stuff. This is part of the common language, but a lot of people don't even think about where that comes from anymore. And like I say, despite the fact that this stuff has been completely immersed in the conspiratorial world, and people discuss the MK Ultra possibilities, and discuss Jim Jones as an individual, they don't often look at the rest of the story, as it were. And we're talking about a very serious, large mass casualty event that occurred here. So that's kind of where I leave it. But I'm not going to make any sort of declarations about this. I want to hear your story, and I want to try and bring it to everybody else. So let's first talk about who you are, basically. We don't have to go into great personal detail, but let's just talk about who you are, what you mean by an insider's look, as is noted in the title of your book, and so on. Let's begin there.
Okay, I grew up in Washington, D.C., really in the political. My whole life was pretty political. My mother was involved with politics. So until I went to college in 1965, I, was working for the Democrats and trying to get people elected, and in Washington trying to integrate the local amusement park. We had a lot of laws that were beginning to be passed. Martin Luther King was trying to encourage us to be an integrated nation, and he said, the most segregated time in American life is Sunday morning at 11 in the morning. And so he was trying to change that, and I completely agreed. So I tried to help with that. So my formative years, in a way, were in Washington, D.C., in the area where political conversations went on all the time. During that decade, when I was in high school and in college, that was the worst, most violent decade of American history. And that's when John Kennedy and Bobby Kennedy and Malcolm X and Martin Luther King and Medgar Evers were all killed in that one decade. And so really by the end of the decade, my feeling was that I did not want to be in a world that was run by bullies. I had to do something to take charge, and, I tried working with the Black Panthers for a while with the free breakfast, and that worked. I thought that was a great program. It didn't work out for me personally. Then I went to Woodstock. I thought, that would be a really great way to spend a couple of days up in upstate New York, and that was all right, but that wasn't a lifestyle I could choose. So about that time, my sister convinced me to move to San Francisco, and I moved to San Francisco, and really in March of 1970, I came face to face with Jim Jones up in Redwood Valley.
And by this time, Jim Jones was already well known as an activist himself. In a way, of course, the People's Temple, as it became to be known, because I've spent a little bit of time studying him a bit, This guy was about integration, which was something that was certainly on your agenda. You were a progressive thinker. You were definitely, moving more toward what we would now call, the liberal side of the equation regarding a lot of things. But definitely just being a generally a good human being, essentially, and being politically active, it sounds like to me. And of course, Jim Jones, this is, less than a decade from the tragic events that did occur in Guyana. But at that time, he was well involved already in politics in San Francisco, right?
No, actually, he had come from Indiana, and when he was in Indiana, he was kind of with the Midwest mentality, and he had thrived in the Midwest with a dedicated group of about 100 people who came west to California. And so he wasn't overtly political, but he did things that showed that he, believed in integration. He and his wife were the first white couple to ever adopt a black child in the state of Indiana. So during the way, he made a great effort to, actually make a difference in the community he was in. But he didn't get involved in San Francisco politics until the early 70s. When I came in, he was just he had a group of first 100 and 200 and 300 people in Redwood Valley, which was about 2 hours north of San Francisco. And he kind of formed his strategies while he lived out in, kind of the boondocks. He lived out there, and then we started traveling around, and we went to San Francisco and Seattle and Los Angeles. And finally, he found that it was a very harmonious fit for him to work in San Francisco and Los Angeles. So they became the churches. And that's when he started, pursuing the political rather than the social and religious parts of his, of the work he was doing.
Well, okay, that's a good point. I guess it's more fair to say that he was a social activist more than a political activist in 1970 when you first came face to face with him. But later on, a few years later only, he would become involved politically, actually become a player in San Francisco politics pretty much.
Absolutely.
Based on all that. Of course, when I'm talking about, and I did mention the fact that this was the guy who, sold monkeys door to door at one point. That was something he did in Indiana at one point in time, right? And I know it sounds like I'm making jokes here, but it's actually true.
That's really part of his persona, that he was born, he had nothing going for him as a child in terms of, a stable house and stuff. He was very innovative from early on. He had a mother and a father who was disabled and kind of out of the picture. And then finally there was a separation. So he really started with nothing. And part of the empire he built is based on, out of nothing, you can create a community in a utopia. So don't let your poor beginnings stop you. There are things you can do. So in a way, he integrated that into who he was. He was not born with a silver spoon in his mouth.
Well, right. And of course, this is a very interesting way to come up. I mean, after all, it's representative of the American dream, after all, to start with nothing and to achieve, your higher goals in life, to actually affect social change. I mean, these are all seemingly really great things that he was attempting to do at that point in time, which as I've said, ended up in a totally different narrative, essentially, because we all, like I say, we all focus on the end result of what happened, but a lot of people do ignore the sort of build up to it.
Right. I think that one of his most endearing qualities early on was he seemed so humble. So if he saw you emptying trash cans, he'd come along and empty them too. Or he'd go up and say, I noticed that you're the only one emptying trash cans. I really appreciate it. And so in a way, early on, the kind of support he gave for people who did the work around the place was really one of the things that gave us the most pleasure, because you could be doing any kind of work and he would come by and stop. So early on, that humility and that acceptance and the, feeling that you were on equal footing, whether you were entering trash or doing legal work, he always, generated that kind of, egalitarian society. He always wanted that. And so early on, before, he became his own elitist, early on, that was something that was impressive.
Well, right, and again, in combination with the fact that he was extremely inclusive, from a racial standpoint, this very much fed directly into the spirit of the time, as it were, because after all, there had been, the terrible situation immediately following, Dr. King's death. A lot of civil unrest all throughout the '60s. So, leading out of that time, he would have been seemingly like a remarkable kind of figure, although he was in the right place, also being in San Francisco, but still. A very remarkable figure as someone who was sort of a social activist. So, this is when you meet him, though, in 1970. How does it progress from there? I mean, how did you become further involved?
Well, I think that when I had seen these leaders that I had respected so much shot down and killed, or, different things happen to different people, he seemed to be somebody who could lead through the transition time. I was looking for somebody. I had tried working by myself with the Panthers and in other areas, and it hadn't worked out well for me. So in a way, I was looking for somebody who had the character and integrity that I was looking for, who could be a dynamic spokesperson, and he seemed to fit the bill. So for about 2 years, I watched everything he did like a hawk. I went into it, I was already an atheist. I wasn't looking for religion. I was looking for somebody who was politically astute and who could lead us in this difficult time. And so I checked out everything. I checked how he treated his kids, how his wife looked at him, how he treated people in the congregation. Did he say what he said? Did he live the way he talked? Was he consistent? Was he a hypocrite, or did he seem to believe it? I really checked him really well for about 2 years, just saying, okay, I want to make absolutely sure about my own decision. And then after 2 years, I said, okay, that's it. I'm not going to waste any more time on deliberating, was that fair or not fair? I buy it. I'm all for it. And in a way, at that point, I kind of turned off my critical thinking. I stopped watching him and just started getting more involved in what we were doing, which was, integrating, having free soup kitchens, having legal aid in the church. After meeting, people could talk to lawyers. I worked in the welfare department. I helped people write, their appeal letters if they were turned down from disability or welfare. And so we had like welfare rights, disability rights. We had doctors and nurses there and attorneys. We had this whole system set up to help people, to service the people in the community. And so I just stopped watching Jim. And so while I was doing that, he started getting this enormous ego because he was given so much adulation in San Francisco and was gotten so involved in politics. He just became more and more power hungry and more really sucked into the power elite.
This is partially because there was a tremendous power vacuum from a leadership standpoint, as you so aptly point out, and as I often point out on my show, that essentially the agents of change, the progressive, the people that were looking toward the future, the leadership in this country was essentially decapitated via the assassinations and the agitations that went on in the decade of the '60s. And that includes, John F. Kennedy's assassination, that includes Malcolm X's assassination, that includes Dr. King's assassination, and yes, Medgar Evers as well, who is often forgotten on that list. All of these individuals actually, having been removed from the scene, I do state it very, very succinctly all the time that essentially the progressive movement was decapitated. There was absolutely no leadership. So, of course, this caused a vacuum, and social injustice had not been cured by 1970. We still had problems. There was a great deal of progress made. Civil rights were still up in the air. there was still, women's rights were still being debated publicly at this time. I mean, there was a lot of things still going on. So there was still a need sort of for leadership, and of course this guy comes along, and what he's doing from a community standpoint is rather remarkable also, because it seems as though he was really truly serving the community and taking care of the poor people who are often the last to be served by anyone. And that was the thing, and of course without regard to race or any other sort of preoccupation that was often associated with helping people. This is what this guy seemed like. But but the thing is, over time we discovered, a great many other sides to this man and what went down, of course. So let's lean forward just a bit, because of course we're all familiar with the films there where people are coming in and trying to film the congregation, and he's seeming to protect his people that are there, giving him that great adulation, telling them not to film the congregation. They can film him all day, but don't film the congregation. Don't harass his people. This kind of thing. He seemed extremely protective of his flock, as it were.
Yeah, I think that as he, by the mid-'70s or, the 1974, I do think that he had transitioned himself from being somebody who saw himself as a man of the people in a way. I mean, not exactly. I think that he had a personality disorder from early on. It didn't just develop in 1975. I think early on he knew he had a propensity to really take charge and be a wild person. That's what I think. And I think that early on, as a child, when he used to travel, whether he was selling monkeys by door or whatever he was doing, he'd stop by churches and he'd see somebody in the pulpit who seemed to have the whole audience mesmerized. And so he said, okay, that's the job I want. I want the job so that when I speak, nobody talks and everybody's looking at me and everyone pays attention. That's the job I want. And so from that point, he set his goal to be a clergyman of the highest order. So I think that's what motivated him early on, because I do think he was, he had an incapacity early on. I think it was probably, you could diagnose him as having a narcissistic personality disorder early on. But anyway, by the time the media came, he just wanted all the attention. And it didn't have really anything to do with protecting anybody. It's just that by that time, he was the one, he wanted to represent what was going on in the temple. He wanted to be the personification of everything right and just and integrated. And so really it's almost like he would monopolize, he wanted to monopolize any film that was taken. And so whatever he said, which was, oh yeah, protect my flock, that's not, I don't believe that for 1 second. I think that he wanted that position.
Well, right, and of course he was involved in a lot of different things. I mean, at one point there was a choir, that went around a bit. There was a basketball team. There was all kinds of things that came out of the People's Temple that were, all sorts of, you'd almost call them extracurricular in a way, but I mean, there were all these programs going on, as you stated. There was all sorts of assistance, legal assistance, medical assistance for people that were essentially poor, and much as he was looking to be a leader, I think that a lot of the people that seemed to be in the flock apparently were also looking for a leader. So it was sort of a kind of a toxic train wreck almost waiting to happen. And I hope you don't take offense to my characterizations of some of this stuff. Feel free to correct me,
No, I mean, I think that's right. I think that first of all, Jim Jones was a genius in anticipating what people needed and wanted. And so a lot of people came to People's Temple just as I did. I was at a crossroads, should I continue to be a political animal knowing that I'm not making good choices and my life is kind of disintegrating in front of my eyes? Or can I kind of suck it up or get it together and be part of a movement led by somebody who seems to be, everything I want in a leader. And so he was able, when I came in, somehow, he knew that I wanted to hear his political stance. Somebody else who was at a crossroads could come in and want a religious, change in their lives. Somebody else might want to come in and have a place for their kids to be in a safe environment. So he would figure out, when we came in as newcomers, as new people, he would figure out what probably would be his presentation that would touch us, that would reach out to us. And so he was able to encourage us through this bend in the road to become part of the temple. Whether we were religious or political or whatever, he'd figure it out.
Well, right, and that's a really good point, is that he was sort of a shapeshifter in a way, because it seemed as though, when I've spoken to other people that interacted with him, and listened to some of the sermons, especially some of the stuff that was recorded in Guyana, but some of the early stuff as well. And it seems to me as though, he was sort of shifting his positions a bit, keeping them all coherent, though, at the same time,
Right.
which does speak to his intelligence. I mean, we're not talking about someone who wasn't highly evolved from an intellectual standpoint here.
That's right.
Despite the fact that he was, rather sort of narcissistic and probably, to some degree a megalomaniac at one point. But the thing is that this guy definitely had, a cloak for all occasions, it seemed. Let me ask you this: when did you first hear about the mission to go to Guyana and all of that, and how old were you?
When I moved into People's Temple, I was 23. And, well, let's see, I was about 23 when I came in 1970. And after about 2 years, I was put on the Planning Commission, which was a group, kind of a strange-looking group. It was either the really hard workers or people who needed to be watched, so Jim wanted them close at hand, or people who were married to people who wanted to be watched. So it was one of those groups that it depended on you. Everybody came with a different talent or a different lapse. So the Planning Commission met once a week overnight. And so in the Planning Commission in about 1973 or 74, we started talking about how even with the programs we had, we still had our youth getting in trouble. And then in 1974, one of our students in San Francisco overdosed. And so we, in a way, it was a slap in the face to say, here we have all these programs, but we really still can't protect our kids from the drugs that are on the corner. And so we started talking about setting up a promised land. And Jim had been to Guyana in the 60s, and it had a socialist government under Forbes Burnham. And we started talking about it because, Guyana was an English-speaking country. It was half black, half East Indian, and just a sprinkling of Chinese and white, but it was a mixed community and a socialist government, and in the tropics. It was almost like made to order, and so we went down to take a look at it. The Planning Commission went down for a trip, and we saw it in Christmas of 74, and I fell in love with it the very first second I was there, because the rainforest was exquisite, the people were wonderful, I mean, just everything about it. So that's when the talk started, and that's when we finally made the decision that, okay, we need to push forward on it. So by 1975 and 76, we had a group down there clearing land and building some of the first temporary housing.
Well, Jonestown had been the site of something else previously, hadn't it?
No, it was, since we left, they tried to have some Hmong from Vietnam stay there, and they've tried to resettle it, but it's so far off the beaten track, it's just too expensive to maintain it. So it has not ever turned out to be anything. But because we were making this huge investment, and we had our own ships, and we had our own workforce, we were able to put together this community, that housed 1,000 people. But it was nothing. We cleared all the land when we got there.
Okay, because I had read at one point that it was actually owned by another religious organization previous to that, and this is where the purchase was made. So you're correcting me, but how did they acquire the land and all that? Do you know about that?
Yeah, the government had a border dispute with Venezuela. Venezuela is right, over the hill from Jonestown. I mean, within 10 miles or so, or I don't know, close by anyway. And so there was a border dispute between Guyana and Venezuela that if Guyana could populate this northwest district that bordered on Venezuela, if Guyana could populate it with 10,000 people over the next 10 years or so, then it would remain in Guyanese hands. And otherwise, it would go back to Venezuela. So Guyana was very interested in having people live in the Northwest District, but it was so far away. There were no facilities, there was no hospital, there was no reason, no draw to bring people up there. So when Jim went in there, he said, I want someplace really remote. I want to be on my own, really remote, away from anybody's watching eyes, everything. He really wanted it remote. And so then it worked out that we could lease that land and build our own medical clinic, which took care of everybody up in the Northwest District for free. And then we brought in our own population. And then, Jim had resources. He had money. He had, our own ships. And so we brought in our own business and textile industry and different things. So we helped build up that whole area. So Guyana, especially then under that government, they were delighted to have us there.
Yes, I've seen a lot of focus on the agricultural aspects, of the community, but when it was first being proposed, what was the idea of trying to sustain the community? I mean, was it going to be completely self-sufficient? What was it that you were going to produce that was going to essentially fund the whole thing?
Well, we definitely wanted to be self-sufficient. And when we first went down there, we were naive to think that we could farm the area and grow enough food and have enough animals to feed us. We would never have been self-sufficient, but we didn't know that early on. So once we were there and we were planting things, we were really literally there. I had lived in Guyana 19 months. And so I was there from pretty much the beginning to the very end. Most things you grow, any kind of citrus, any kind of trees, things take years to develop. They don't just develop. You can't plant a tree and have fruit within the year. So, we planted things. We had sweet potatoes and cassava and edos and hill rice, and we had a piggery, and we had chickens and cows and things. But we were not self-sufficient, and we would never have been. Even with the things eventually, being ready, like citrus takes 5 to 7 years. So at the point that we realized that we'd never be self-sufficient, we started our own cottage industries. And so we started, we were going to make wooden toys that we could exchange along the river, because we had a boat that went up and down the river, and we bartered. So we would give, wooden toys that we had made in Jonestown, or we would make soap that we made in Jonestown, or some other things that we made in Jonestown, and we would exchange it for the things that we needed in the community. It might be fresh produce, or it might be, more chickens, or it might be, rice or bread or whatever it was. So we started coming up with things that we could sell and trade in Guyana, so we would be self-sufficient, but not just by agriculture, but by an actual barter system.
Well, what was your actual job, during the 19 months you were there?
Okay, the first year that I was there, I stayed pretty much in Georgetown. And what I did is I bought all the supplies we needed in Jonestown. So I would buy all the truck parts and, toothbrushes and shoes and, magnifying glasses or glasses, anything that people in Jonestown needed, that would be what I'd buy. And all the fresh produce and rice, and I'd go to the abattoir and pick up sides of beef and sides of pork. So I would do, buy everything that the community needed. And, at the beginning, everybody needed everything, because you don't really know what you need. And if you're 24 hours by boat from the closest town, which is, Jonestown was way remote, by the time you realized you needed it, there was no way to just run out to the corner of Walmart and get it. So we had to ship everything in. So my job for the first year was staying in the Georgetown house, even though I traveled to Jonestown from time to time. But my home really was in the Georgetown house. And then after a year, I went into Jonestown, and I was on an agricultural crew. So during the daytime, my crew went out and we early on picked greens and brought them back to the kitchen for the seniors to clean and cook for dinner. And we'd plant sweet potatoes and weed and pick cassava and do all the different things that were out in to bring produce in for the meals. And so we did that during the day, and then in the evening I would teach Spanish to the kids in the school, and then after that I'd put in a couple of hours at the law office typing and working in there. So, but primarily I worked in the field when I was in Jonestown.
So you were very familiar with the whole agricultural scene, as it were. Relating to what was going on, because I've seen a lot of different discussions about this. How there was within the first year or so, they started to see a lot of shortfalls with supplies and things, because I guess, as you said, it takes time to cultivate the citrus fruits and things like this, and it's a different environment too from what anybody had been used to, because the majority of the people that were there, I mean, they were, from where? Primarily from San Francisco, I guess some from Indiana.
Yeah.
From the initial sort of migration to the West Coast there, but the bulk of the people that were actually there were probably from the West Coast. So
there was a huge learning curve, because here I'd been a social worker, right, in California, and then all of a sudden I was a field worker in Jonestown. And so we all wanted the community to thrive, but we weren't experts yet. We had to learn things the hard way. Like, I can remember we tried to make our own food for the pigs in the piggery, and so we wouldn't have to buy feed and ship it out. So we grew whatever, I don't know, barley or whatever it was we were trying to grow, and it didn't work with the first set of pigs, so they never grew. They never got fatter. So almost everything we did, we had to do by trial and error. And there was an urgency about it, because when I went down to Guyana, there were about probably 50 people in Guyana altogether. And then within a year and a half, we had 1,000 people. So there were 1,000 people in Jonestown who needed 3 meals a day. And many of them had special diets. About a third of them were children, a third of them were from, 18 to 60 or so. And then a third of them were over 60. So we had a lot of people on special diets who had to be very careful. And so we had these 3 meals a day for 1,000 people in the middle of the rainforest when we weren't self-sufficient. So, I mean, there was an enormous weight on all of us to keep working and work as hard as we could to get things done and be ready so we could take care of things.
And while this is all going on, though, how did the the PA system and the the, I don't know what to call them, but those presentations that he did, I mean, this stuff is all going on at the same time, right?
Yeah, I mean, so there are 1,000 of us, but not everybody could work in the field, and not everybody could do these things. But we had mechanics who kept all the equipment running. We had the electricians who put up all the wiring and had a radio tower that, was probably 500 feet in the air. So they put that up so that we could get radio contact there. We had street lights. We had streets with sidewalks and fences. So people built everything. But towards the end, we were building a cottage every week, and the cottage would house another 12 people at least. So, we were moving quickly, but it was all, it was too slow for what we were doing, for bringing all the people over. And, and that's just one part of what was going on. The other part was that we were working and we were kind of keeping our eyes on, the housing and the agriculture. Jim was in a whole other dilemma, because in the United States, the newest magazines had started saying, we don't understand why Jim Jones is so powerful. Who is he? He's not an elected official. He's just some guy. Why is he so powerful? Why is it that, that Jimmy Carter comes to town and his wife spends an hour alone with Jim? Or why is it that, the Mayor Moscone is running for office and every time he's giving a press conference, Jim's there with members of the church? What's going on? And so people started being a little bit curious about who he was and why he had so much power. And they were doing investigations. And, Jim had covered up a lot over the years. So,
well, another thing too is that people were getting a little bit concerned because there was a large population, as you stated, of senior citizens who obviously weren't going to be field hands and probably not the most effective at building the community themselves. There was a lot of children as well who weren't going to be able to contribute to the efforts, right? And this winds up leading to actually the whole visit by Congressman Ryan. Later on, right after all this speculation in the press and complaints from family members back home, right?
Well, the seniors who were in Guyana, a lot of them worked in the sewing room, sewing toys, and worked in the kitchen, cleaning greens and doing food service things. And so, in a way, they're different issues. So, for the most part, actually, people in Jonestown were happy to be in Jonestown. And if they thought things were primitive, they thought it would work out because everybody was working so hard. So the majority of people in Jonestown felt that things were working out and getting better. But there were people in the United States who had relatives in Jonestown, and there were people in Jonestown who wanted to leave. And so the word did get out that Jim was not letting people leave if they wanted to leave. And so that's what started the concerned relatives getting involved, and that's what started getting Congressman Ryan from the Bay Area, getting interested in finding out, doing some kind of research on what was going on.
Well, right, and this is, but really reasonable if you think about it, that people would be concerned, and I mean, what did you observe about people's will to leave or stay? I mean, as you said, it seemed as though the majority wanted to stay, but there had been a contingent that came up that wanted to leave as well. I mean, what did you see personally from that side of things?
First of all, the community in Jonestown was complicated, and I was a zealot. Like, I loved it there. From the moment I got to Jonestown, I loved it. So if somebody didn't like it, then they wouldn't talk to me about it. Do you know what I mean? Like, because they would find other people who were not happy. I was happy. And so in a way, I didn't know people were unhappy about being there. So that's, first of all, people were not going to, confide in me and tell me that they were unhappy. Because in Jonestown, I was a zealot. I loved it. And I was also part of the planning commission. So people did not talk to me about complaints. But what I did know is that if somebody talked about wanting to go and Jim would bring it up at a public meeting, he would say, you know what, we're in the beginning of creating our whole utopian community here. Can't you give us 2 years of your life to set this up, get everything perfect, and then anybody who wants to leave after 2 years can go? So he said that, and he, was very persuasive. And at the time, I told you my critical thinking was off. I thought, you know what, we're right in the middle. We need everybody. It would be great for people to just commit to make this the best it can be, and then they can go. But the people who wanted to go, first of all, they didn't believe Jim, and they were right. I believe Jim. When he said that, I thought he was telling the truth. No way. In no way would he have ever let anybody leave.
Well, see, that's the thing. I mean, I personally sat and listened to tapes of some of those public meetings where, he would call people up, and start saying a lot of really, I hate to use the word, but a lot of crazy things to them, about what should be done with them. And things like this. So it seemed as though, if you were happy to be there, great. But if you weren't, you were kind of a captive, and at that time, as you said, you had sort of shut down your critical thinking regarding this. So you probably felt as though, these people were just misguided, and I guess Jim would sort of set them straight, huh?
Yeah, and I mean, from my point of view, I thought, well, they were selfish because the people who needed to be there, were there and they were getting taken care of and having a good life. And so why couldn't people just not be quite so selfish as to want to go? I mean, so, I guess in that way, I bought Jim's line. That was Jim's line. Why would you be selfish? Why would you go back? You made this commitment. Why don't you stick with the commitment? And so, I did buy that, and I didn't, I didn't think about it enough because it didn't apply to me. For me, my life was really good. I was right where I wanted to be. The community was thriving, and especially because, towards the end, Jim wasn't public as much. He didn't come out of his cottage as much. I didn't know why, but it didn't bother me. I just saw the community growing really quickly. It was kind of like living in your house with a grandparent, and, you're kind to the grandparent and you talk to them and everything, but really you have your own life. It felt like we had our own other life in Jonestown, and Jim was not that much a part of it.
Well, at one point, they were playing tapes of his, I'll call them sermons, I guess, instead of having him come out and do the live thing that he was doing. But of course, there's other accounts that I've heard that, and again, this stuff is scattered all over the place. I mean, to try and get a coherent story out of this is very difficult. But the thing is, I've heard that, sometimes after these, many hours of loop tapes together, would be played occasionally in the middle of the night. He would come out and sort of call everybody to a congregation, I guess. And this was part of what was going on. But I mean, when did you think anything of it at that time when there was, like more tapes playing over the loudspeakers as opposed to him making those public appearances? I mean, did you feel anything was sort of going wrong, or was it just a matter of, well, that's okay, Jim is stepping back and we're going to do this together as a community?
With me, I was really blind at the time, because if he played, like, he would play he would play tapes 24 hours a day, but it's kind of like if you are watching, you're in your house and the TV is on, it's kind of background noise. And so at some point you just say, okay, you just kind of disregard that it's even on. So in a lot of ways, that was the way it was with Jim. Even though he had the tapes going on all the time, still, like, you just turn it off after a while until it wouldn't bug me. I was able to do that. Or if I worked out in the field, I wouldn't be able to hear the tapes anyway, and so then I wasn't bothered by it. So I think that there were crazy things that went on, and so certain people were more affected than others. I think if I had stayed in the community and listened to the tapes, 24 hours a day, all day, every day, it would have affected me more. But since I was out more in the, in the woods and in the wilds picking greens and stuff, I wasn't around it. I did not have a clue that Jim was as crazy as he was, ever. I had no clue until, November 18th, 1978. I had no clue.
Well, and this is the thing. I mean, when you're talking about, when people start to bring up terms like brainwashing and mind control, I mean, regardless of the fact that, the perception might be, well, gee, it's just background noise or whatever else. I mean, the subconscious still receives it, and this is obviously a factor. But some people have told me that the sleep deprivation, because of the constantly being on call and constantly having the sound playing and things like that, were part of the conditioning that went on. And this is the supposition, obviously, from people that weren't there. But what I'm saying is that you could see how that perception is easily made, right?
Well, I believe that, that I was blinded in the situation, but that it was all horrible, and that the continuing noise was harassment that people couldn't get past. I'm a Quaker now, and one of the things that I love about being a Quaker is that when you go to meeting, you sit in silence unless you want to speak from the heart or speak, the voice of God or speak out, but really you sit in silence. And so one of the things that we never had in People's Temple ever was silence so that you could kind of come to grips with things. We were always harried and rushed and exhausted, and that was just the part of the lifestyle. And so all of that is harassment, and it certainly goes to being brainwashed, because you can't resist if you haven't had time to just kind of regroup. Then, and you're pushed forward, you don't really have time to establish how you feel about it or what you want to do. So all of that absolutely is part of the control that Jim had over us. And whether you call it brainwashing, it was certainly Jim's control. And it was certainly his power to not give us time to rethink our positions. I liked what I saw. I liked what I saw in the future when I thought about us having a coherent community. And so I was not as aware of the things happening as I should have been. And I think that the people who were happy there, for the most part, we didn't see how insidious it was, and we didn't see that Jim was addicted to drugs and completely out of control.
Well, and see, that's the thing, is that, because you're in a constant state of not being able to reflect or to examine things, in a peaceful setting of your own, you don't have the time to give an honest evaluation. So what happens is, this is most certainly one of the mechanisms of control that he used to keep his flock in line, as it were. And I hate using these terms regarding this situation, but I mean, I don't have better ones. I'm sorry. But this is the way it comes across. And of course, yes, there is the whole issue of the fact that he, through his drug use, was probably becoming a bit more unstable, and all of that.
And certainly paranoid.
Right, and paranoia certainly accompanies that sort of state of mind. And being that, as you noted, probably initially, though you weren't really privy to it because you were sort of blinded by the benevolent nature of what was going on, you can see now in retrospect that there was definitely something at least narcissistic and problematic about this guy as a leader of people. But anyway, now we've gotten about to the time when you were working there, and later on you had gone into the community and started to work on an agricultural crew, as it were. But also, holding down other jobs. I mean, you had multiple responsibilities and stuff. When did you get a sense that there was going to be a problem, or was it a complete shock when this happened?
I did not see a problem, because in the community there wasn't a problem. The problem was when Jim interacted with the community. In the community, we had the integration was pure. You could tell by the children that were born in Jonestown were multiracial, and the workings within the community were exactly what we wanted. People who had been incarcerated went to Jonestown, and they were the best they ever were in their lives, in charge of whole departments and things. So in many ways, the community was thriving, and what was holding us back really was Jim's insanity and his keeping us exhausted. And so because I wasn't around Jim very much, and because, really I wasn't... At the point I was in Jonestown, I wasn't there for Jim Jones. I wasn't there for him as a leader. I was there for the community that we were building. And so I didn't notice him disintegrating before my eyes, partly because his secretaries and mistresses who lived with him or around him in his cottage, if he were too incoherent, they wouldn't let him out. If he was going to be completely drugged up and incoherent, then they'd cancel the meeting that night or something, or keep him so that nobody saw him. So it was kind of like the code of blue, that we hear about with policemen. They would really protect him from losing our engagement or losing our support if he was too out of it. And so a lot of things that we would have seen if he had just been on his own, they kept that was a secret. So there was a group of 10 or 15 or maybe 20 people who knew that Jim was a drug addict, that, he had abused people, that he was getting more and more paranoid, and that he was less and less functioning. And they just hid it from us, so much so that even the last day when Jim was incoherent, all his secretaries and mistresses went ahead and put out the vat of poison and everything. He didn't do any of that. So I think a lot of times that the group that was around him just caught his insanity and his, irrationality. And when he couldn't do it, they had just planned for it, and they just went on about their little jobs, as if they were him. They just took charge.
Well, see, that's interesting, like as if his inner circle was really controlling most of what was going on, and occasionally they would bring him out almost as a prop at that point, it seems you're saying.
Exactly right. That's exactly right.
Which is really odd, and also cuts both ways in a way here, because after all, his inner circle were probably the most devoted to him personally, as a leader, as it were. And of course, you can even find this stuff now floating around on the internet. Some of the last sermons, and in fact the very last sermon is around now. I had it many years ago, and really it would make me shake my head quite a bit that anybody was listening to this man during his last days, because a lot of the stuff he was saying was just wow. I'm very, very sure you're familiar with the whole clip about when he's screaming about how he's ready to fight, and all of that. I mean, I'm sure you're familiar with that. I don't know if you heard that firsthand. Did you get to hear a lot of this stuff as it was happening, or?
What happened with me is after I was in Georgetown for the year, and then I went to Jonestown for the next 9 months or so, at the end of October, there was all kinds of stuff happening. In San Francisco, the newspaper came out with the article, Congressman Ryan was going to come to Jonestown. The other newspapers were beginning to research and trying to figure out what went on. And there were all these horror stories about people being held in Jonestown. So all that was going on away from Jonestown. So in Jonestown, we didn't know about any of that. So at the end of October, Jim asked me if I would go back into Georgetown and go back and do the sales that I was doing before, buying supplies and stocking the boat. So at the end of October, I went into Georgetown with the basketball crew, because the basketball team was going to be in an international competition. So the basketball team and I all went into Georgetown, and the people who were living in Georgetown came back out to Jonestown. And so those last 3 weeks in Jonestown were by far the worst. And so some of those, horrific sermons were done during that 3 weeks that I was not in Jonestown.
And this leads up to the time when and of course this is why the basketball team was spared those final days, because they happened to have been slated to go on that competition and all that, and they were actually on one of the ships at the time of the incident, right?
No, actually, they were in Georgetown practicing because Jim, when I was in the house in Georgetown, we all lived in one house. And one of Jim's secretaries, Sharon Amos, was the one who was handling the radio room. And so she got a message from Jonestown. They had set it up in advance with a message that was, okay, everybody in Jonestown is dying now. It's time for people in Georgetown and San Francisco and LA and Redwood Valley to all commit suicide. So Sharon Amos sent me out to get the basketball team so that she could give them the message. So they were playing basketball or practicing or something, and I brought them back to the house. And she met with, Jim's sons and a few other people and said, Jim has given the word that we're all to commit suicide. And Stephen Jones was 19 at that time, and he said, absolutely not, we're not doing it. He's crazy, we're not doing it. Let me go out to Jonestown, I'm going to stop it. So not only did we not commit suicide in Georgetown, but Sharon, was rebuffed, and Stephen said, we're not doing it. It's all over. We're not doing it. So he told her no, and then he started calling San Francisco and Redwood Valley and Los Angeles and saying, we're not doing it. Don't follow that instruction. Jim has gone crazy. We're not doing it. Do not follow that instruction. And he kept calling until he was sure that everybody got the message, that it was all over. And so at that point, Stephen stopped it, but Sharon went upstairs in the house in Georgetown and killed her 3 children and herself.
Wow. And now, I want to back this up just a little bit, because this is remarkable, and this is stuff I have never heard before. Okay? But here's the thing. I want to back it up a little bit, because Congressman Ryan, were you aware that he was coming?
I think that I knew that he was coming to Guyana, but I was in the Georgetown house, and he stopped in at the Georgetown house and climbed over the back fence with all the news media. So they came into our house in Georgetown. I was not expecting that. And so he shook everybody's hand and said, I'm the Congressman Ryan. I'm just checking to see that you're all okay. And, Jim had stocked the house with people who liked Jonestown. So the reason I was in Georgetown was because he knew that I was a zealot. I loved Jonestown. And so he purposely got people out of Georgetown who were going to complain to the congressman. He got people who really loved what was going on. So he had set it up, and he, set me up, and it turned out it saved my life. But at the time, he was the only one who knew.
And he was really just maneuvering the squeaky wheels, as it were, away, and that would be the reason for you being dispatched out there, so that you could be there, and the congressman might be able to meet you, and maybe that would be the end of it, right?
Yeah, it could be, or at least it would, at least he would have the perception that not everybody was interested in going. He would at least meet people who were there, who, had spent time there and who loved it. So, it was just making sure he got that point of view early on.
Well, what do you know about, because since you were not on site at the time, what do you know about the events that led to the congressman's death?
Well, I know quite a lot, because one of the things that I do, I'm in touch right now with 60 of the survivors. So we're on email together, and we have a lot of contacts together, and many of us meet, a couple times a year, either up at the anniversary on November 18th at Evergreen Cemetery, or this year we had a kind of a retreat down here in San Diego with 30 of the survivors coming. So we do meet up, and we're in touch. My very best friends in the world are my fellow survivors. I mean, they've been through everything with me, and so we're in touch. So we've talked about all of this. But what I know is that on the night fantastic, musicians and talented actors. We had wonderfully talented people.
Well, the choir itself was really incredible, actually.
That's right.
Yeah, that's one thing I can attest to, because I've had some of those recordings as well, and it was really interesting. Even the kids were really actually very talented. I don't know. I guess that was sort of produced by the exercising of those kind of talents through these talent shows and things, right?
Yeah, and I mean, we just had wonderfully talented people, and so a lot of people, put energy into dancing, and I mean, so we did have a lot of, we had so many wonderful things. In a way, it masked the horrible things that were going on because people could feel fulfilled if they were, talented and singing and creating and stuff. So, I mean, it makes it that much worse that everything just washed out, just horrible. But so Ryan had this whole show, and at the end he stood up and on a lot of the documentaries it shows him saying, I've been in Jonestown. I can tell that many of you love it here and that you found your home here and that you're delighted to be here. And so then he stepped down from the podium, and almost as soon as he stepped down, people started passing him notes saying, I have to get out of here. Jim won't let me leave. Don't leave without me. Don't believe Jim if he says, I'm going to go in 2 weeks. He won't let us go. We need to leave with you. And so by the time the next morning came, there were 18 people in Jonestown who wanted to leave with Congressman Ryan. So, 18 out of 1,000 people seems so lightweight, and yet Jim was so paranoid and so really mentally unbalanced at the time. He just couldn't stand to see anybody leave.
Well, there's also the idea that there were many more people that wanted to leave, but they were afraid to speak up, because of the kind of volatile situation. I mean, do you know anything about that as well, or?
Well, I know that there are 18 people who wanted to leave who, got on the truck. And I know, even if there had been 50 or 100 other people who wanted to leave, I don't believe it was that many. I think there were that many people who wished Jim would leave. I mean, I think there were people who were happy in the community, but who didn't want to have anything to do with Jim's leadership.
Mm.
So, but, I mean, people decided to leave, and I don't know if there's any way to know how many other people would have left. I know a lot of people did see through Jim at the end. Even a really good friend of mine, Versi, who was in Jonestown with me, and we both survived in Georgetown, she said, that by the time she heard Jim's incoherent speech when he was giving the talks on the, on the overhead or on the audio system there, she knew that, there was something terribly wrong. So, I mean, I think a lot of people did know that there was something wrong with Jim. But that's not the same as wanting to leave, because I think a lot of people were like me and they loved the community. They just hated what Jim was doing to it. And so I don't know that there's anything to know that. Tell me.
Oh, okay. Looks like it broke up a little bit there.
Oh.
Can you hear me? Okay. All right.
So, I mean, I just think that, so if 18 people left, and even if 100 other people had wanted to leave Jonestown, still, you still have 900 people. So, I mean, or 800 people, like, for Jim to be, just completely lose touch and say, well, we can't go on if if 18 people leave or 100 people, he was just completely, out of control and completely lost any vestiges of sanity at that point.
Well, I mean, and what a contingent of people rolled up on the plane, and all of this happened. I mean, what do you know about that?
Well, I know that the 18 people went on the plane with Congressman Ryan, and soon after that, Jim sent a truckload of people with guns to the airstrip with instructions to kill Congressman Ryan, be sure to kill him, and whoever else they could kill. And they did go, and they shot Congressman Ryan and killed him, and killed several newspapermen, and killed Patty Parks, and wounded a number of people, including Tim Reiterman and Vern Gosney, who was leaving Jonestown, and Jackie Spear, who is, a congresswoman now in California. So, they shot a lot of people and wounded people, and then they got on the truck and went back to Jonestown, and they all died also.
Well, and that's the thing. So when these guys came back, whoever they were, that Jim had dispatched to do this, right? I'm a little confused as to the timeline, because what happened next? Had they gotten back by the time this, the final meeting, as it were, was underway, or?
The final meeting was underway, and Jim was telling people, he had gathered everybody in the pavilion, and he said, things will never be the same again. There's no way for it to ever go back to the way it was. So, because we have conspired to kill a congressman, and right as we're talking here right now, we have the congressman is being killed as we speak because we have conspired to kill a congressman. So from the very beginning, Jim said he did not take responsibility for what he had done. He put it on everybody. People who had no clue of what he was doing. He made it like, okay, so now all 900 people have conspired to kill the congressman, which was total garbage. That was not true. But he said, and things will never be the same. You can't go back to San Francisco. You don't have your houses. You already donated them to me. You can't go back to your relatives. They don't have anything to do with you because you're going to be a felon as a conspirator to kill the congressman. What's going to happen to your children and grandchildren? They'll be taken from you and put in foster care because you're unfit parents because you allowed the congressman to be killed on your watch. And he went down this whole litany of things that would never be the same for all the people who were there. And, here are these people who are absolutely exhausted, who are in this remote area in Guyana, and most people don't know where Guyana is, and it's 24 hours by boat from a city they never heard of. So you have these people who are completely isolated from any kind of reality, like no relative could say, that doesn't make any sense. So, and then Jim started this harangue, and then, while that was going on, the truck came back, and they, let Jim know that, yes, Congressman Ryan had been killed. All these guys, on the truck who had never killed or hurt anybody. There was never a time in People's Temple history that somebody was shot and killed. Never. And so all of a sudden, these people who had never shot anybody, all of a sudden, they were handpicked to go shoot the congressman and come back, And so Jim was just completely berserk at that time, and he had, compromised these people who had trusted him.
And this is where he's repeatedly screaming, "They're never going to leave us alone," and this is where the solution is. And here it is, and give it to your children, and all that. And as I said at the top of the show, this is where like I said, the common vernacular about drinking the Kool-Aid comes from. Because of that. I mean, what do you know about those events, though? Because you were miles away.
What I know is that Jim was haranguing the adults, and in the last meeting, a lot of the kids were over to the right side because a lot of times the kids would all sit together, not interspersed with the adults. For one thing, there weren't enough seats for every 900 people in that little pavilion. So a lot of times the kids would sit over to the side, and so as Jim was haranguing everybody and saying, things would never ever be the same. You couldn't go back. There's no going back to your old life. It's completely gone. You have no choice, really. There's no choice left. And so Jim was continually haranguing the adults. And then at the same time, people on the side, the people who had, played the part of being nurses, went down and they were giving the poison to the children. So by the time the adults really looked around to see, already children were dying. And so then there really was no way of going back, or there was no way to live with yourself if your child had died while you were sitting there. I mean, there was no way going back for them.
Well, and this is the thing. I mean, they didn't all just drink this stuff either. I've read reports that some people were injected. I guess that would be mainly the children, though, right?
No. First of all, there's not any way of knowing because there was nobody on site who saw how many people were injected and not. And by the time the medical examiner came in, he couldn't tell because the bodies were already too bloated. So first of all, there's no way to know how many were actually injected, but if there was any example, pure example of brainwashing, it was at the end, and people drank the poison. The vast majority of the 900 people drank the poison.
Right. I mean that's for certain that there was a majority of them, but I'm just saying that there were other stories that have surfaced, regarding this, and I just wanted to see what you had to say about them, because there was the idea that some people were actually shot toward the end. Of course, Jones himself did not take the poison, did he?
That's right. Jim was shot, and his nurse Annie Moore was shot, and so most people, but not all, because really everything that you think is a fact, people have differences of opinion about that. It seems like at the end, Jim's nurse shot Jim and then shot herself.
Mm. And then meanwhile, like I said, you were miles away, and the person you were with, I forget her name now, but she had heard the order go out. And the intent actually was for a mass suicide to occur in a lot of places with people that, that sort of adhere to the Jones philosophy, as it were, right? I mean, there was actually going to realistically, it could have been a whole lot worse. In other words, what did occur was one thing, but there was actually people that were going to be stateside that were supposed to have committed suicide as well, and you and the basketball team and everybody who was outside of the settlement were also intended to do the same thing as well, right? Okay, well, I'm not sure if you can hear me right this second, but this is a truly, it's really one of those events, and like I said, there's been a lot of speculation, regarding what actually happened. And over the years, we've been treated to a lot of theoretical ideas about what was coming. Let's see now. See if I can bring Laura back. Okay, I think she's back now. Hello, Laura? Okay. Well, point is, like I was saying, the event could have actually been a whole lot more numerous in its casualties. And there you are, Laura. Okay. Can you hear me?
Yes, I don't know what happened, but anyway.
For some reason, you dropped off the call, and I don't know why. But really quickly, please, because before I forget, because, believe it or not, we've actually been through almost an hour and 20 minutes of this. I wanted to give you a chance to tell people where they can find your book. Tell them first your name and where they can find your book, because I didn't even, I did, I think at the top of the broadcast, tell people who you were, but I'd rather if you did it and told them where you prefer they'd find your book.
Great. So my name is Laura Johnston Cole, and I have a website, www.jonestownsurvivor.com. So I have a blog on there, and I have a lot of information, that we won't get to covering today, but different experiences. Also, I have a Facebook, Jonestown Survivor, on Facebook. My book is available on Amazon, and it comes out as a print book or Kindle, and it's also in an Audible format now, so you can buy the Audible book, and you can buy the Whisper so that you buy the Audible and the Kindle, and you can read some yourself and listen to some yourself. So it has all those, different aspects to it. The other thing I do is I travel around the country a lot, and I speak at universities and libraries and conferences about either history of the 60s and a lot of the things that are going on, a lot of things that went on in the 60s that brought people to People's Temple. So I speak about a lot of the issues, also about what are the red flags about cults that you need to watch for, and was it a new religion, and how do you work with communities. I'm on the board of directors of the Communal Studies Association, and one of the things I'm working on now is I'm working on oral history. I've collected 10 recordings of oral histories of the survivors. I'm going to do another 10 or so this year. And at the end of this year or the beginning of next year, the plan is for about 15 of us to go back to Jonestown. And I'll have part of it as an oral history that people will dictate into their own cassettes and recorders, their experiences and their reflections and memories during the whole process of getting there, and they'll journal about it, and we'll take pictures, and at the end we'll have some kind of a public program that will bring in the audio and the visual and the pictures and have people get a greater understanding of what went on with People's Temple when we were all together.
Well, this could be an amazing documentary, actually, with all those oral histories and probably, with photographs and films that were contemporary with the time, as well as the more current views of the individuals standing on the very same spots in Jonestown where they were, in 1978. So that sounds like it will be an amazingly enlightening project. Excuse me. And this is one of those things that I think is extremely worth learning for people, because after all, the dangers that befell all of the individuals who were touched by this are not dangers that are too far away from our current times. I mean, plenty of people in turbulent times can seek out things that they think are sort of salvation that turn on them, and often cults and any sort of organization that winds up in such a disastrous way. I mean, of course, this is pretty much the exemplar in modern times of this type of disaster. In my opinion, and I do see it as a human disaster, regardless of whether people, intentionally drank the Kool-Aid, as it were, themselves, or they were, or were induced to do so, or whatever else. I still see it as a horrendous tragedy and a serious loss of life, and of course, again, it seems to have, benevolent roots to begin with, and then, of course, the whole thing sort of turns on you, and this, of course, is based on the fact that you had a drug-addled and unstable leader who caused all this stuff to go on. So I find it to be an amazing story, and I want to pick that back up a little bit. I know that this might be a little bit emotional for you, but here it is, the meat of the thing, after all, when we're talking about what actually happened that day, and the number of casualties, and, how many people died. And it was also horrendous, the handling of it afterwards, because, of course, the medical examiner in Guyana could not even do a lot of the work that could have been done, had bodies been recovered quicker. That was part of a point that might have been obscured, during part of our conversation here. But the thing is, people were sort of left out there for a while. The bodies were left for a bit. And, what was the aftermath like, though? Because, see, since then, there's been a lot of speculation regarding whether, Jim Jones himself was associated with, the MK Ultra program, with the CIA directly. There was, I'm trying to think of the guy's name that they often point to, who was there at the time. I'm drawing a blank at the moment, but there was a guy who he was saying, get him out of here and all that. There was, people point to this particular piece of the tape when Congressman Ryan was there. There was, the accusations of, of CIA involvement and the disappearance of documentation. The drug supplies having come from certain places. Of course, you'd actually know about where the drug supplies came from in Jonestown, wouldn't you? So where did the drugs actually come from that Jim was using? I mean, you'd know where those came from as well, right?
Well, I do know that we had a regular pharmacy set up in Jonestown, and so with nurses and doctors, and so some of the drugs came from the United States, others came from other countries, but as a pharmacy and as a doctor's office, they were gotten legally, but then Jim was shot up with drugs over the years illegally. So in a way, I think that they were not stolen drugs, but they were certainly drugs that were not meant to be used by a drug addict. So I'm sure they came either from the United States or from Guyana or from other places around Guyana. But it wasn't talked about publicly. And even now, people ask me what drugs Jim was on. I don't really have any clue. I've never, before, during, and after, I've never been able to pick out when somebody is on drugs in the first place, much less figure out which drugs. But what I have heard is that he would take uppers so that he could present and seem articulate and, keep his words together and kind of follow a train of thought. And then, if he wanted to sleep, he'd take downers to go to sleep. And so he was in the middle of all kinds of different drugs that were affecting his system. And many of them, appeared to make him more and more paranoid and disable him further. One thing that I wanted to say, when we're talking about Jonestown, a lot of times people say, it was so unbelievable that nobody can believe that really happened. Nobody could look back and say, how did that happen? Nobody knew. In a way, that's exactly how it happened, because we were had the same point of view in Jonestown. We had the same point of view. Nothing like that would ever happen. So it was like not even on the table to be discussed. It was so far from everybody's reality. And so because it was such an enormous effort, it was like beyond our comprehension that would ever happen. And certainly that Jim Jones, the person who, had given legal services and soup kitchen and all that, it was certainly beyond anything that we could expect from somebody like Jim Jones. And so in a way, I've noticed more and more the reflection of people saying, it's just unbelievable. That's exactly how we felt in Jonestown. Too unbelievable to even consider that would happen. Do you know what I mean? It's really the same consciousness or the same rationale. And so it's interesting because a friend of mine who works at a library where I spoke at recently, after I spoke, he wrote to me and he said, to have a conversation with somebody who's intelligent, who is not easily caught up or persuaded, and to know that same person or people like that person were completely so mesmerized or so brainwashed or so persuaded by Jim Jones that 918 of them would die is just beyond comprehension. And when he said that to me, I realized that's why we didn't see it coming in Jonestown.
Well, it is a good point. I mean, it does seem almost unbelievable and inconceivable to me that there wasn't a greater amount of individuals that just sort of said, look, no, I'm not going to do this. Refusal. You would figure there'd be a large population of people that refused, but then again, they don't necessarily understand the nature of being, under the spell, as it were, of somebody like this.
And they couldn't believe the consequence. I mean, they couldn't, it was just unbelievable. Like, if you had said to people when Ryan was leaving, okay, so if you don't go with me, you're all going to die, then everybody would have gone with Ryan. Do you know what I mean? But it was unbelievable that that was going to be the choice. And so they didn't make the decision to go because they did not realize it was a life or death decision. They thought, okay, so Jim's going to live another month or two with whatever diseases he has going on, and then the community will bounce back and be wonderful again. So, I mean, it wasn't a life or death decision at that point because nobody knew how sick Jim was.
Well, and there were some people that I've read this again. Like I say, I'm testing a lot of the things that I've heard and read over time about this event. I've read that there were some people that did flee into the jungle, during this time. Now, I don't know what the number of individuals was. Nobody can ever seem to give me a clear answer as to that. Do you have any clue as to how many people actually did, say, look, I'm out of here, and kind of run away?
Well, the first thing in the morning of that day, the morning of November 18th, 1978, Leslie Wagner Wilson and 11 other people went into the jungle, and they said it was a picnic, but they knew they were never coming back. So she wrote a book, Slavery of Faith. And so she survived with her son, and her son was the youngest person to survive from Jonestown because she walked into the jungle with these other people, and they just hiked many, many miles to get away from there. So she, was smart enough to have an inkling that she wanted to protect her son, but she left her mother and sister and family members who likely would not have gone with her. So she lost almost her entire family except for her son, including her husband. So she did leave. And then when Jim had called everybody to the pavilion, one of the women, Hyacinth Thrash, she just put the sheet over her head and stayed in bed, and then woke up the next morning. And Grover Davis is a senior man, and he went up to the security guard and said, I don't want to die today. And so the security guard just let him walk into the jungle. And then two young men were able to get out after everything started. They came up with an excuse, they needed a stethoscope or something. So Jim sent them out, and then they just ran into the jungle, and they survived. And then Jim sent 3 people carrying bags of money to go into Georgetown, so they survived. So it was 3, 5, 7. So 7 people, and the people who went on the picnic were the only ones who survived from Jonestown.
Well, and yourself and the basketball team.
Yeah, but in Jonestown. In Georgetown, there are about 50 of us who survived.
Ah, okay. So really, the greater number of survivors were in Georgetown.
Absolutely, yeah.
Okay, because I've had a great deal of trouble wrapping my mind around this to begin with.
Yeah.
And to give you a little insight, I'm a bit younger than you. I was born in 1972, so first news of this for me was as a child. It was just one of those sort of unbelievable things that occurred in the world. And as the years went by, there were many documentaries made about it, and and a couple of different books. And I do believe I read the Slave to Faith book at one point when I was much younger. But the point here is that there were so many different ideas about how this all actually happened, floating about, as it were. And like I said, people have talked about the possibilities of it being an experiment that again went terribly wrong. That was part of the MK Ultra program and all of that. I don't tend to necessarily believe that. I think that this was actually an organic thing that occurred, but it still is one of those things that is very, very difficult for anybody to wrap their mind around. That so many people would voluntarily just lay down their lives, without a fight, essentially, at the word of this, this leader who, had kept them in a state of exhaustion, had been definitely, exerted control over them, via the different mechanisms we've talked about tonight, of course. But of course, you get beyond that for a moment, though, And when did you realize that all of this had happened the way it did?
It took me a really long time. When I first came back, um, first of all, I didn't understand why I survived. I had no clue, and people said, "Oh, you're blessed and you survived." I said, "I'm not blessed. This is not a blessing that I'm working through here." It was really difficult to survive knowing that everybody else died. So, and at the beginning, I thought that, something had happened and that there was a fluke that everybody died in Jonestown, and that I didn't put together any chronology of how it was built up. So I didn't see that, and I, was mad at Jim, and I really thought he personally had led the assault on everybody else. I thought he was the one responsible. And really for about 20 years, I really blamed him for doing it all. And then after 20 years, I met back up with all of the other survivors at the 20th anniversary. And then we started, a more introspective discussion about what happened. And first of all, we were all blinded and we didn't take care of business properly. So, most of us or all of us probably feel guilt that had we just been more alert, we would have seen it coming. But, we didn't. And so we ended up surviving, but any of us could have surviving. I don't know that most people saw it coming. But after about 20 years, I realized that, first of all, Jim was incoherent at the end. And so his mistresses and secretaries were the ones who put the feed on his plan. So he had the plan. He couldn't do any of it. They're the ones who set out the poison. They're the ones who started distributing the poison, the flavor aid and everything. So they were very much involved, and in fact, actually orchestrating it, because really he was just sitting and they knew exactly what to do, how to do it, and everything. So the very last day was not only not just Jim, but he was completely, inept or out of control and lethargic. And so really his mistresses did it all, set up the poison and everything. So that's something I didn't know at first.
Have you ever listened to, and I can imagine it would be horrifying personally, but I mean, have you ever, had the, had the force of will to listen to that final tape?
Yes, I have listened to it.
All right. Well,
I mean,
I have personal impressions of it, but I mean, I'm very curious what you would have to say about it.
Well, Jim, as bright as he was, one of the things that he did on the tape is he set the tone that there's no choice. We have to kill ourselves. It's revolutionary suicide. They're not going to leave us alone. And so he set that tone. And then when Christine Bates stood up to talk, Christine Miller stood up to talk, he let peer pressure just beat her down. So in a way, what he did is he manipulated people even at the very end, even when he was nearly incoherent. He manipulated it so that he wasn't the bad guy, so that the people in the audience told her to shut up and sit down. So, what it showed me is that he was, he knew exactly what he knew what he wanted to do, knew how to get there, how to work out the end result that he planned to get. And then he just coerced people and beat them down and brought up all the part of the divisive culture that we lived in, because, racism was certainly alive and well in 1978. It's certainly alive and well today. So we know that racism is a huge problem that we have to overcome in this country. And so he just brought out what everybody knew, which was, after adding his own paranoia to it. So he just broke down everybody's resistance to what he knew he wanted to have done. He had the poison in Jonestown for at least a year before November 18th. So he knew somewhere in the back of his mind that it might come to that. He had it in his planning. It was not a spontaneous event that day. He had been planning it or discussing it, or at least having that possibility and getting the supplies for it much earlier.
Well, yeah, I mean that's something that that you don't do on the fly. I mean, obviously, as you've discussed with the supply lines the way they were, it was something that he had to have planned for. And you're aware that he had the poison there at least a year before.
Yeah.
And this is the thing, It's one of those things, though, that every time I've tried to examine this event, I got to be honest with you, it is so beyond my comprehension that that this happened the way it did. That I have entertained some of these other ideas about the way it went down. I think that it's very interesting, though, that you explain, and this is something I've never heard anybody actually explain, that the inner circle, those secretaries, those mistresses, those nurses, whatever it is you wanted to call them, but the people that kept a close association with Jim in those last few months definitely had a great amount to do with this, and bore a great deal of the responsibility. And of course, as you said, collectively, even among survivors, there has to be, I mean, it's kind of a trite statement, but I mean, survivor's guilt is a reality. You ask yourself, why did I survive? You ask yourself, why did the circumstances allow me to not be there when so many others have perished? I mean, people do this in all sorts of scenarios. So this is reasonable, and of course, you start to think about what you could have done to prevent it, personally, and I'm sure that others who you have spoken to as you collect these oral histories and you get together, at these anniversaries and observances of the event, you also find probably very common among all of you that there is a sort of, what could I have done to not make this turn out the way that it did.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. And so those of us who survive, I just heard an interview with one of the survivors the other day, and they said, well, how do you live with it? And the person said, I I gave up my power during that period of time, like the rest of us, and it's horrible, and it's part of who I am today, knowing that I'll never do that again, and that I'll protect those around me if it ever comes to it. But there's no question that we live with both the survivor's guilt and also guilt, that for our fellows that were the people we loved better, more than anyone in the world. I mean, they were our adopted family or our family. And so, it was a horrible thing. And so all of us, especially the ones who have kind of grown in spite of that experience, those of us who knew we had to keep going anyway, it's very much a part of who we are. There'll never be a time in my life that I'm not a Jonestown survivor. I may be a teacher, and I may be a parent, and I may be all these other things that I am, an activist or a member of Occupy or whatever, but I'll never have a time that I'm not a Jonestown survivor because it's very much a part of who I am.
Well, in the last 15, 17 minutes here, that is where I want to get to is, how you came through it and who you are today. And yeah, it absolutely has to be a part of you as would be any event of consequence that you would go through in your life. But I mean, as you moved forward, I mean, has it been, I'm having trouble formulating this question. Like what do you take from it? What do you see it as now? I mean, obviously you lived through a remarkable event in history, a tremendous tragedy for those that were, your adopted family, because there was a very family-like atmosphere. There was a very community-like atmosphere. Jim Jones' maniacal, diminished state aside, there was a real community. There was a real a sense of togetherness there, and to have lost all these people and to have carried on since, I mean, I hate to put it this way, but I mean, what is that like to carry on and to be so far from it now? How is that looking back? I mean, do you still, are you still kind of faced by the nightmare of it, or do you see it as a tremendous kind of learning experience? I mean, obviously you do, because you're trying to share, through your experiences, the dangers of situations like this. As you said, that's why you speak publicly. But I mean, just from a personal standpoint, I mean, how is it that you kind of carry this today?
It's interesting. When I came back from Guyana, I was completely bereft. I was so, traumatized by everything. I moved into another community for 10 years. I moved into a place called the Synanon community, and it was for a drug rehab facility, but I didn't use drugs. But I was just so despondent, and I really needed kind of a safety net around me. And so a drug facility, it worked out because, people were up 24 hours a day watching out for people who are, going through this withdrawal. And so in a way, it was what I needed too. I needed something to keep my mind going and not to just be sitting in a room by myself. And so for 10 years, I lived in a community, and part of the charm of that community was it was a high verbal community. And so we would have lots of frank discussions called the Synanon game, and that really helped me because I didn't just isolate myself and keep myself separate and not talk or cry. Actually, I cried pretty much the first 5 years, but while I was in there, I met my husband. We've been married 32 years now. My son was born in 1989. And then Synanon was closed down in 1990, and I just went to work. I went back and got my bachelor's degree in psychology and philosophy. I got my teaching credential. I've been teaching. I taught for 25 years, every age from bilingual kindergarten to adult. And I just retired in June. So I did that. And then, along the way, I've been an activist in voter registration, and I've been involved in different more actions to bring some more honesty and care to our community and society. And then I wrote my book, Jonestown Survivor, An Insider's Look, in 2010. When I came back, I took a 20-year break. I just couldn't get involved with People's Temple. I had to rebuild my life and kind of get some of the building blocks of my life together. So really, for 20 years, I didn't have anything to do with survivors or anything. I just went to work. And then I went to the 20th anniversary, and when we met up, we realized that we all had so much in common. And even though our points of view on everything are different, we don't agree on anything hardly. I mean, even like there are some people who are in the temple who totally believe the CIA controlled Jonestown. Several people who think it was a CIA operation, and then others who don't. I mean, we have every point of view, but when we get together, we kind of don't even pause at the stuff that's extraneous, or we don't pause at the fluff. We really get into it and try and figure out why we didn't see it or what different ones of us knew. And so it's really clarified my thinking a lot to realize that we gave up too much of our power to Jim. We love the community, and I think it could have thrived without him. We could have stayed in Jonestown if he had died or given over power and somebody else had taken over. I mean, I think it could have been more successful, not died when, with all this, if Jim had just died. But, we have all these points of view, and they are my kind of reality check. If I get too far, I think, I can't imagine why I survived. And I meet with the survivors and we talk about that. So we have this really in-depth friendship and relationship that pretty much keeps us all stable and working on ourselves and moving forward. So we have what I call PTSD, People's Temple Stress Disorder. We're all affected by that. And, the guilt and the life experience and missing our dreams and missing our family, all of that is very much a part of who we are today. So
Well, that is part of the point of this, of course, is carrying on and moving forward, and as you said, there are different points of view about this, and I wanted to I wanted to get your point of view. So this has been extremely enlightening, though, and I got to say that. That is still, I think that that it's very good work you're doing regarding speaking out about this publicly, talking to people about the dangers of situations like this, because, I don't know if you're aware, but I mean, there are new communities that do pop up all the time. And the possibility of a Jim Jones-like figure emerging once more, maybe in a slightly different cloak, maybe, I view him very much as a wolf in sheep's clothing. So I would say that, in a different sheep's skin, you could find somebody just like him, very easily in the world, especially, in the sort of more tense, postmodern kind of world that we live in now. In the greater technological age, all you would have to do is sort of, create an off-grid community, and it would not be hard for this very same thing to occur once again. And this is something that I think is very, very worthy of discussing in order to avoid it.
A point about that is that one of the things that People's Temple and Jim Jones has created is a current example of what a cult could do. In People's Temple, when people said, oh yeah, don't join that group for whatever reason, they couldn't refer and say, think about what happened at Jonestown. Do you know what I mean? Like, we had no point of reference that would give us any kind of understanding of how things could go wrong. There wasn't a time that you could say, oh yeah, but even with Heaven's Gate here in California, and I don't know if the Branch Davidians fits in here, but for sure Heaven's Gate, now we have concrete examples that if a child or somebody we love wants to join a group, you say, you know what, wonderful people join People's Temple, and look what happened there. Be careful. Don't shut down your critical thinking. Keep your eyes open. Don't assume everything's good, and don't assume every person who looks good is good. He could be a con man like Jim Jones.
Right, and even the best intentions, as it were. I mean, we've all heard the phrase that the road to hell is often paved with the best intentions, right?
That's right.
And this is precisely what seems to have happened with Jonestown in general, because there was a great vision, a great possibility that could have been there, a community that would have been away from the urban sprawl, the difficulties of modern life, as it were. Kind of away from, despite the fact that that Jim himself was drug-addled by the time of his death. For the most part, this was a great place for people to start who had been sort of swallowed up by these types of problems. Mm-hmm. This was a good place for people to find a new community, a new place in the world, and at the very end, of course, and throughout time, it wasn't simply on that single day, but it was absolutely twisted and turned into something else, and again, there are the possibilities that intelligence agencies could have been involved with some of this construction, and so on and so forth.
We were certainly monitored. There's no question about that. We were certainly monitored.
Yeah, that's provable, because the first contacts, I mean, we know about the contact that you received, in Georgetown, but the first time that the news came out to the world is kind of suspect, even regarding what actually happened, in that way. So for sure that at least people that are involved in that kind of business were certainly monitoring the situation.
That's right. No question. No question about it.
And there's no question about that. So, just one more time, because we are down to the last 5 minutes or so, so I'm going to say this. You've been listening to The Ochelli Effect, and tonight we've been talking to Laura Cole, Kohl, by the way, if you're looking for it on your search engines, and she's the author of Jonestown Survivor, An Insider's Look. Okay, and that is the book which she has explained to us very well, is available in various forms, Kindle, Audible, paper standard old-fashioned kind of book form, which I appreciate most. But also in that new whisper format where you can partially read it and also listen to it. And, in these last few minutes, I always say this to every guest, but I mean, is there any sort of capper to this you'd like to give to the audience? Any sort of last words that you'd kind of like to leave them with regarding the entire message here?
One of the things that sometimes when I present, people say, well, why don't you talk so much about Jim Jones? And really my thought is that Jim Jones is the one we all hear about. The ones we don't hear about are the 918 people who died. And so, they were wonderful people. They were people who would have made a difference in the world. And so that's why I don't focus on Jim. He's had plenty of the attention over the years, but really he was not the most important person in People's Temple. It was these other people who had given up everything and eventually their lives to try and make the world better.
Right, and this is the thing to remember, is that although it's very easy to focus on the leader, although it's very easy to focus on that character, and there's been plenty done about that. You're exactly correct. We need to remember the human toll here, the absolutely lost possibilities to the world that occurred here, and as you did say, these were people that laid down their finances, their families, their lives, and their very essence at the end, their place on this earth they gave up. In this effort to seek a better life and to actually change things in the social spectrum as it stood and as it stands now, even. And this is the important thing to remember about this, and far too often it has been ignored. And I do seriously thank you for joining us tonight and going through this, and I'm sure that a bunch of this was very emotional for you. I apologize if I said anything rudely to you or asked any questions that were a little harsh. Tried to avoid that. I didn't want to get into a lot of things that would be extremely nasty, but to discuss this situation without getting our emotional hands dirty is kind of impossible, because after all, there was 900 plus individuals who died that day, and only one of them was named Jim Jones. So, this is the thing.
I also, many times when I speak, I do encourage people to write to me or to, let me know if there are questions or things that I didn't cover, because a lot of times the one thing I didn't say is something that one person would be curious about. So you can always contact me through the website at the jonestownsurvivor.com, and I can get back to you and I do love questions. And I have been asked many questions over these 36 years, and so you don't have to worry. I've already probably heard the questions, so feel free to contact me if you have questions that I didn't cover.
Right, and really, again, I can't thank you enough for having gone through this with us tonight. And it's still one of those things that despite your very more than adequate explanations of everything that's gone on, I still have an incredibly hard time wrapping my mind around this, but I'm sure you can understand why that would be for somebody like me.
We all feel the same way, though. I mean, that's universal. It makes no sense.
Right, and at the end of the day, it is extremely senseless to lose lives, that again could have produced who knows what in the world, among 900 and some odd people, the children that could have been born, the children that were lost themselves, the potential and life in and of itself is a loss. So, the mass casualty event, I generally think of it as a massacre as opposed to a suicide, because I don't feel as though those people's wills were entirely there enough for them to have actually committed suicide. This may be me splitting hairs, but that's how I view it anyway. So.
Yeah. I agree. I did think, at first it was suicide, but really, as the years go by, it was definitely Jim manipulating people all the way through and not letting them have their own peace of mind to make a decision. So I do think it was murder. I started thinking it was suicide, but I've changed my mind over these years.
Right, and that's exactly where I come down on it. Thank you guys for listening. Everybody have a good night. Stay tuned.
Webcam microphone up close.
At the age of 19 in 1962, she was
See, but I have the files. I read this stuff at the National Archives, and I read these other things.
I said to
in
myself,
all these
that
books,
guy
and how
reminds
can that
me
be
of
possible?
the brain.
Pistols and fondle slab of choice. I don't know when that was. It doesn't really matter. Internet, professional wrestlers, and not Jesse Ventura style. It doesn't matter where the information comes from as long as it's real. It doesn't. It's hard to get real information because seriously, they don't want